Day Master Dennis Monokroussos, and we've got some more games to look at from you, the viewer. The first one is from Monokroussos once again, and he presents another win over his perennial opponent Fortunato. So I actually don't want to say too much about this game, in part because he actually annotates it quite in depth himself. So I just wanted to make a few quick comments for his benefit in passing. So he had white, and it was a dragon. Pretty mainline stuff, except for rook e8 here. So this has been played, but it's a bit unusual. Generally, black doesn't have to be so terribly concerned about this exchange. And also, it's not really even a threat yet, because after bishop h6, bishop takes h6 hits the queen, and on queen takes h6, the knight on d4 is hanging. So black should just play the usual bishop to d7, or, well, yeah, bishop to d7. Okay, so rook e8, castles, bishop d7, h4, h5. Okay, so this is all right too. Bishop h6 is okay, but I think h4 is fine. Anyway, so here, and now knight c6. And this is actually interesting, but, I mean, it can be dubious. I remember Anand played this against Kasparov, not in this exact position, but in this general kind of structure in their 1995 World Championship match, and that didn't go so well, but it can be played in some positions. Anyway, here black certainly should play b takes c6. After he took with the bishop, white does a very nice job of just whipping up an attack. It's quite serious. Okay, d5. Here, actually, white can just grab the pawn on d5. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. But this works quite well, too. e6, f5, and now, although white criticizes this in his notes, in fact, it's very good. g4. So he might not have calculated all the tactics, but, well, actually, he said he missed black's next move. But still, g4 is a very good move. So d4, knight e2. Bishop f3, gf5, takes, rook h1. And, alright, black is up the exchange, but, his king is obviously in huge, huge trouble. I mean, white's got a lot of attackers. The pawn on e6, the pawn on f5. Don't forget these. These are very relevant. Both bishops, the queen, this knight is ready to jump in f4, and the rook is ready to go to g1. So white's got, what, 7 attackers here. I mean, that's a lot. That's more than you need. So, bishop to g7, rook to g1 is quite good. Knight f8, takes. And now, funny enough, another move that white criticizes in his notes, but is actually very good. Knight f4. So he recommends queen g5 instead, which may be just fine, but this is certainly fully up to the job. Okay, king f6, and it's only here that white starts to let things slip. So in this position, you might want to try to figure out what white to move should do. It's an instructive moment. Okay, well, white is winning even after the move played in the game, which is knight takes g6. But the best move is queen to e2, cutting the king off. And this is a very useful concept, something to keep in mind when you're an attacker, and it's that when you're attacking the king, you want to make sure that you don't drive him to safety, and that's what happens in the game. Black's king gets chased out of the king side, all right, but he ends up being, okay, not in great shape, but surviving over on the queen side. So queen to e2 cuts off the exits, and after a natural move like queen to d6, which white saw in his notes, he gives knight takes g6, but much better is just to give mate in 2. Rook takes g6, check, knight g6, and knight h5 mate. So black can stop that, but he can't stop other mates. It's mate and just several more moves here, pretty much no matter what. So cut the exits, and then give checkmate. Okay, so knight takes g6, takes, fg6, king e6. And again, white is winning, but black can at least wriggle around a bit. So queen f4 is actually a decent move, but once again, our hero for the game misevaluates it. Again, in this case, because he missed a tactic. So after queen to d5, he sees the right idea. So white played b3. Very logical. He wants to play bishop to c4. Black played queen to e5. And after this, his advantage is mostly gone. So white is still a bit better and recovered pretty nicely and went on to win. Again, playing really, I think, pretty well overall. But much better than b3 is just to use that tactic straight away. Bishop to c4. Queen c4. And queen f7 check. So that would have been a reasonable way to finish the game. So he would have missed the very nicest win, but this would have still been very convincing and pretty clean. So the game got a bit more messy as it went on, but still good enough. And overall, a very nice attack, even if there were some things that were missed along the way. Okay, well, let's go on to our next game with Kitty Loaf. What a name. And an anonymous opponent. And this too was a pretty nice and pretty well played game. Okay, so Kitty Loaf has white, and we have the Fischer attack, as I think it should be called. Not to be confused with the Sozin. So I have nothing against the Sozin, but the Sozin is this: knight to c6, bishop c4. So I don't think that this deserves to be called the Sozin. Anyway, e6, bishop b3, bishop to e7, and okay, I should say about this that I think b5 and knight b to d7 are both, well, they're certainly more popular, but I would also even hazard to say that they're probably better moves as well. Okay, so bishop to e7, and now a good choice by white, g4. And it's very logical. The idea is, of course, just to push this g pawn and to attack. And white has scored very well here. Okay, h6, rook g1, knight c6, bishop e3, queen c7, h4. And this is actually all. This has all been played before. h5. This was played once, and it turned out okay. Takes. And I should say this idea of meeting h4 when white has already played g4, playing h5 against this. This is well known from the Keres attack. This maneuver or trick or procedure. This idea. So g takes h5, knight h5, and here white used the typical Keres attack move, which was bishop to g5. This might even be an improvement over the one move that had been played before in a game, Chuprov against Zagrebelny. So Chuprov I haven't heard of. He's a 24-20 rated player at the time of this game, 1995. Zagrebelny I've heard of. He's GM and he's been around for quite a while. So that went bishop to d7, castles, knight e5, queen e2, and just in time, rook c8, so that after f4, knight to c4. And, okay, this is still a very interesting position. Black went on to win, but I think white is still, okay here, but nothing so special. So bishop to g5 might be a small improvement. Okay, now here black played queen to b6, which seems kind of artificial to me. I don't think the queen is well placed on b6, and forcing this exchange is not really such a heartbreak for white. More natural move is knight to a5. And I was thinking, well, maybe what black was worried about was some lines where white plays knight to b5 and takes on e7 and takes on d6, something to this effect, but it doesn't really seem to work. I mean, if you play this, then black just takes, and on bishop e7, plays king takes e7. Well, even if he plays queen takes, he's okay. So this just seems to be nonsense. So if the idea of queen to b6 was to get out of the way of knight to b5 things, I really don't think it was such a good idea. It wasn't necessary. So knight a5 I think is right. Say bishop takes, queen takes, rook g5. And this is kind of amusing at first because we have a fork of a pretty unusual variety, but since this bishop is capturable, it's all fine. Rook h5 is a blunder, black just takes and ends up big material ahead. So a takes b3. And here black I think needs to be kind of careful. If he plays g6, now actually knight d to b5 is good, taking advantage of the pin and threatening the d6 pawn. And there's not really any convenient way to protect it either. Maybe knight to f4 is playable, queen to d4, rook h4, knight d6, check, king f8, and rook to g1. And white's probably a little bit better here. Well, not probably. White, I think, just is a little bit better. So black has pretty decent pieces on the king side, but on the queen side, they're not so good, and black's king is also a little bit awkward as well. Okay, another possibility after takes and takes is instead of g6 to play knight f4, so not creating that weakness on the diagonal. So here, of course, white will take knight to g6, and we end up with a very murky position. White has several possibilities, including, again, knight d to b5, going for the d pawn, king f8, takes, takes, knight takes, and e5. And this is a very unclear position. So something like this is probably a little bit better than what black played, although the game isn't so bad for black just yet. So queen to b6, takes, queen takes, bishop takes, king takes. And the king is not that exposed yet, so it's dangerous. You know, it certainly puts him in a position where he has to be really very careful, but I think it's tenable at this point. Queen to d2, b5, castles queenside, bishop to b7, rook to g5. And here, maybe something like rook a to d8, overprotecting the d pawn, or g6 to keep the knight and the pawn both well protected, might be a little bit better. So after knight f6, I think it's getting a little iffy for black. Probably rook takes g7 is best, but f3 is okay too. Here I think, again, black should seize the moment to play g6. Instead he played rook takes h4, and now white has actually several moves that are pretty good. White played the most natural move, which is okay, rook takes g7. More flashy move that is also okay, but not really winning, is knight to d5 check. So this is kind of interesting too. But there might be an even better move for white. So once again, you might want to try to figure out what that better move might be. Well, it's a very elegant combinational blow. Bishop takes e6. Now, the easy variation is f takes e6. Then white just plays rook takes g7 check. Next up is queen to g5, and black can already resign here with nothing to regret. So king takes e6 is the only try. Now knight to e2, threatening the fork. King to d7, knight to d4, queen c7, and now knight f5. So more fork action here. We're hitting the rook and d6. So something like rook to h5, takes, takes, knight takes d6, threatening lots of nice discoveries. And if king to e6, then queen to g5, and white's winning here. So bishop takes e6 seems to be just a winning move. There's some accuracy that's required after that, but it looks like white should win by force with correct play. So rook takes g7 is good, but not best. Now here black should probably play queen to c5. But he played rook to h7, which is very natural, and got hit by a nice shot. Takes, takes, and now knight to d5 check. So it's actually pretty simple to calculate. The trick is just to make sure that you look at the move in the first place. So that's always, we could say there are two kinds of combinations: those which require really accurate calculation, and those which require just that you see them in the first place. And once you see them, it's very easy to work it out. So takes, bishop takes, swap these guys, queen d6, and rook to g1, and it's over. So rook to g8 is threatening mate, and after f6, queen to e6 check decides. So if king to d8, then rook to g8 is just winning. Queen g8 is probably okay too, but queen g8 looks simplest. If king f8, rook g8 is mate, and after queen to e7, I guess black resigned. This was at least the last move that Kitty Loaf gave, and the reason to resign here is simply queen c6 check, followed by picking up the rook with more to follow. So a very nice game. Maybe missed the nice chance with bishop takes e6, but overall very well played. So game that white can definitely feel happy about. Okay, on to the next game. And here, okay, this game's not quite as clean and well, actually this game is pretty decent too. It's not quite as as flashy as the last two, but it's not so bad either. So white in this game is a Class C player, and really the big question here was to kind of compare and contrast what happened in the opening of this game with the Danish gambit. So here's what happened. So e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, takes, and here white had the inspiration not to play the standard knight takes d4, or queen takes d4 for that matter, but played c3. And after dc, played bishop c4, cb2, bishop b2. And, okay, so the question is, well, how does this relate to the regular old Danish with 2d4 and this? So black hasn't played d6, or sorry, black hasn't yet played d6, and white hasn't yet played knight to f3. So, what are the differences? How does all of this compare? Well, I have to say that I'm not a big connoisseur of the Danish. I prefer to simply avoid it altogether with 3d5, and even knight to f6 and queen e7 are playable too. But okay, what we can say is, all right, that first of all, okay, in this version, pawn to d6 we can at least say is a useful move. Likewise, knight f3 is not so bad either. But maybe d6 is, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure, to be honest. Now, the fact that d6 has been played takes away one of black's standard defenses. So after bishop takes b2, I mean, there's the old textbook suggestion of Lasker's to play like this. And then knight f6 with the idea that on takes, queen check, or queen takes, queen, bishop check, queen to d2, takes and takes. We have a roughly equal but definitely unclear and imbalanced position. So at least this defensive idea has been cut out altogether. Now, interestingly, in the regular Danish, d6 is another important move. And after this, white's main move is knight to f3, at least by let's say how frequently the position after that arises. But maybe queen to b3 is the best move. Queen to d7, and now knight to c3, knight to c6, knight to d5, and on knight to a5, queen to g3 is very strong, with the point that on knight takes c4, of course we can play bishop g7, and the game is over. So this line is impossible with the knight on f3. So this might be the difference, or this might be a reason why the straight Danish is a little bit better than this version. Again, on the other hand, though, we've cut out the possibility of the d5 defense. Okay, in our game, so after this position arises, black played knight to c6, and our annotator Raphael, or Star and Ra, gives this a question mark, but I think it's actually fine. I don't really see a problem. I think maybe he's giving us a question mark because knight to c6 in the straight Danish is not really played. Although it's not really clear that this is a bad move either. If there's a problem with this, I'm not aware of what it is. So perhaps those of you who are connoisseurs of this and maybe have the book Danish Dynamite can make some comments to this show and fill in some gaps here. So I looked this up in the databases, and it was played by a number of really strong players, and they won with this, and the computer was happy with it too. But again, maybe there's something really deep in the theory where knight to c6 is actually not so good. I honestly don't know, but I'm at least not aware of a problem with this. Well, one other thing I wanted to say before I go on here, which is that after c3, it seems to me that black can avoid this and play knight to f6. And here we see a big advantage of d6 having been played. So I think this position is one where white has to fight to prove equality. So this, I think, is maybe a good reason to not try to get a Danish in this move order. So maybe white is okay. I guess white could try maybe e5 here, with the idea that on de, knight e5, of course we can't play dc because of queen takes, and then knight f7 check. So I suppose that's the big idea. But okay, black doesn't have to play dc. Maybe you can play knight to d7 or bishop to d6, and it looks to me as if white has to fight for equality there. So anyway, back to the game. Knight c6 happened, which I think is fine. And I think this is actually pretty decent. So again, black has the idea of playing knight to a5 in response to queen to b3. Okay, not right away. You protect the f-pawn first most of the time. But that's in the air. It's looming. So I think this is reasonable. Our castled here. So Raphael castled here. And actually this is probably the best move. But he was thinking maybe instead queen to b3. But here I think queen d7 and knight a5 is coming. And okay, white could play something like bishop to c3, but you can't really convince me that this is the refutation of knight to c6, that white puts the bishop on c3. I mean, knight c6 has definitely got to be a more useful tempo. All right, what else? He also suggests knight to c3. Here, again, I think knight f6 and black is okay. I mean, if knight to g5, then knight to e5. Or if queen to b3, queen d7. And once again, knight a5 is coming. So, castles I think is best. Now, here, black played h6, which really isn't so bad, but maybe bishop to e6 is a little bit better. Takes, queen b3, queen d7. And, okay, queen takes b7 is a blunder because of rook to b8, and white just loses the bishop. And after knight to g5, then knight to d8. White certainly has some compensation for the two pawns, but I don't think that white... I think white still has to prove full compensation. So it's certainly playable for white, but I wouldn't... If you forced me to play one side or the other, I would probably play black. So it really depends also on how much you like to defend. If you feel comfortable defending, probably it's okay to play black here. But objectively, I think black is fine. But white can play it. Anyway, h6 happened. It's not a terrible move, but it is a little bit of a luxury. Okay, knight c3. And a6 is again a little bit of a luxury, but maybe too much of one. So queen to b3 is good. Black played bishop to e6, which is maybe not best, but even after the better queen to d7, okay, threatening knight to a5 once again, knight to d5, and here I think black can play b5 and knight g to e7. But okay, after rook f to e1, see the thing about a position like this is that there may not be any way for white to just force his way in, although there are ideas like a4 or maybe rook a to c1. You can maybe sometimes play funny moves like bishop to f6, although that might just be for amusement value and not strong. But nevertheless, I mean, you can see that white does have some ways of trying to push here. But meanwhile, the problem for black is that it's hard for him to do anything that doesn't just self-destruct. He can't take the knight on d5. Okay, the queen is kind of stuck where it is. Obviously, black is not developing his king side anytime soon, and castling queen side is going to certainly ask for trouble after a4 or, again, jumping on the c file. So, it's a tough position for black to play by now. Bishop to e6 is okay, but again, white's making progress, so it's another maybe inaccurate move. Takes. Here, though, I think white goes wrong. So white took on b7. This pawn's not really so important, so it's better to take on e6. Now, if queen to e7, that's okay. So you're losing a tempo, quote-unquote, by having to retreat your queen, but his queen is not well placed on e7, so you're ready to play knight to d5. You picked off an important pawn, and okay, you can castle queenside, but you've got you have three half-open files over there, so that's definitely all to your advantage. So white's clearly better here. Correspondingly, after knight g to e7, actually, once again, you should just drop your queen back, and after queen to d7, still play knight to d5. So don't even have to bother with the b pawn. We'll just keep building up, and black is in trouble. Okay, after queen to b7, though, it's maybe not as bad off. So he should play knight g to e7, threatening to trade queens with queen to b8. And after queen to b3, rook to b8 is quite good. And you can't take the e6 pawn because the bishop on b2 is hanging. And I think black is equal here. So, or to put it differently, white has compensation for the pawn, but nothing more. I mean, black is, not in great shape, but black's position is still defensible. Still has resources here. Okay, so after knight to a5, queen to b4, it's getting a little bit troublesome. c5, queen a4 check, king f7, rook a to d1, and here black finds, unfortunately for him, pretty nearly the worst move on the board with e5. So just knight takes e5 check, and now black's king is wide open. King e6. Here white played knight to c6, which is good enough to win, but there's a better move. So again, you might want to see if you can figure out what white's best is in this position. So it's always good to practice, get a little target practice in. There are actually a lot of good moves here. I mean, knight to g6 looks really strong, hitting the rook, and after rook to h7, you can take on f8, and if he recaptures, you play queen takes a5. And that's pretty good. The best move seems to be knight to e2, though. So what's the point? You're threatening knight to f4 check, and after king to e7, okay, then you can check on g6 and win lots of stuff. Or you could play queen a5 and knight c6, just winning everything. Okay, and the point is knight f4, you can't go to f6 because of this. So then knight c6 check, and you win the queen. And what can black do? If he plays g5, okay, that makes sense, but now f4, and it's basically just as bad as ever. So f5 check is the new threat. And again, the king either goes to f6 and allows a crushing discovery, or goes to e7 and allows a fork. Frankly, probably f takes g5 is not so bad either, just to blast open the king, but f5 is just simple and crushing. So, knight c6, not quite as good, but still more than good enough. Okay, queen to b6, another blunder. Black should just take, but it's still hopeless. But now white's up a piece, and with a crushing advantage. Well, okay, sorry, it's not winning a piece because queen b2, but queen c4 check, queen c5, and the black position is just in tatters. So black needed to have the queen guarding the king. So black's king is basically without any help, and black played queen takes a2, blundering the queen, and simply resigned. But even without that, it would be completely hopeless. All right, so 3 very clean games so far, and actually the 4th game is quite clean as well. Now this one was from posted to the viewer questions thread, and so I'll read what black writes. So black says he's rated between 1650 and 1700, while his opponent is about 1500. So he says this. So I have a general question: how should you beat players, or how do you beat players you know you're supposed to beat? So the background story says, I've been trying to learn chess for over a year, and I'm still an unrated beginner. I should hop onto the May list, probably about 1650 to 1700 ELO. I consider myself already stronger than, say, 1500 ELO, and that's the rating of an opponent I played and wasn't able to beat in the last round of a FIDE-rated weekend tournament recently. The time control was game in 90 with 30-second increments, so there was plenty of time to think. I felt the positional assessment fluctuated between equal and small but safe plus for me. Naturally, we both committed many inaccuracies throughout the entire middle game, but I couldn't find a way to press. Then I noticed a possibility to enter a double rook endgame, which I consider slightly better for me, even though I don't really know anything about endgames yet. But I figured that he had a weak pawn and my rooks were better placed than his. So it was slightly better for him in the sense that he could at least try to play for a win without any real danger of losing. Continuing the quote, I declined to draw and did that. Alas, I wasn't able to win there either, and we played the game out to a dead draw in rook and pawn versus rook and pawn position. Here's the game. Well, okay, I want to say a few things before we take a very, very quick look at the game. First thing I want to say is that this was exceptionally well played from both players. I mean, given the ratings that were mentioned. I mean, really very logical, no big errors. Really a pretty remarkable game. And actually, all 4 games that we looked at are just surprisingly well played by at least one player, and in this case by both. So that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say is that remember that the rating list is, or the ratings are, what you can derive from them is not that if you're 1 point higher rated than your opponent, you should win 100% of the time, but that, of course, the bigger the rating gap, the more often you should win. So, a rating difference of, let's say, 150 to 200 points means that you should score, let's say, something approaching 75% of the time, or you should average, 75 points out of 100. if you're 200 points higher rated than your opponent. At least that's how it used to work. It may be a little bit different than that at this point, and with the FIDE system. So I'm basing it on the old way the USCF formula worked. So, if you draw a game with black against a player 175, 150, 200 points lower rated than you are, it's not really that unusual. It's not really such a surprising result. And especially since, you were kind of pressing, and it was always between you winning and the game being a draw. But what I would say is this. Excuse me. The main way to play for a win against a lower rated player, someone, somewhat significantly lower rated, but, not way lower rated where you can just win doing practically anything. The main thing that you want to try to do is create problems. Give your opponent chances to make mistakes, especially when you're playing black. When you're white, you can generally get the initiative, maybe get a little edge, and the problems for your opponent will sort of come of their own accord just from having to defend. But when you're black, it's a bit tougher. I mean, you have to try to find ways to create problems, to try to find ways for your opponent to kind of hang himself. And, well, let's start looking at the game, and we'll see why this becomes kind of an issue. So your opponent plays a London system here, which is a very, very solid, even dull opening. But it's very hard to beat this. Black or white is just trying to play extremely solidly. He's going to put pawns on e3 and c3 and put the knight on d2, and maybe the bishop goes to e2 or d3. Pawn goes to h3, and it's just such a rock solid position. First of all, I mean, a lot of times, black will just lose because you might just fall asleep and take this opening so much for granted that you maybe underestimated a bit. So you have to give it a little bit of respect. So this is not exactly the kind of chess to shake up the world, but it's not horrible either. I mean, white does have some plans. But if black basically plays good moves, you end up with these really kind of dull variations where it's hard for either side to really do too much. So when your opponent plays like that, it becomes harder to win. So if I'm playing a considerably lower rated player, I'll often play, some kind of King's Indian or King's Indian type of position, or play for a quick c5, something to create an imbalance so they can't play something like the Colley system or the London and, make me have to work and work and work to try to beat them. I mean, it's not that I'm going to beat them playing the sharper things, but it's a way of creating more problems for your opponent. You create more imbalances. There are more ways in which they can go wrong. Also, a Dutch is another way to try to cause some problems. Now, my own view of the Dutch is that if your opponent wants to play it, you should never prevent him from doing so. But nevertheless, I mean, to be fair to it, I mean, it's a way of creating imbalances, and again, it's a reasonable way. If you like the positions that you get, it's a reasonable way of trying to bother lower rated players. Okay, so let's kind of zip ahead here. So white is playing a super solid version of this. Okay, black plays c5. So again, trying to get a little edge somewhere, but again, white doesn't even have to be overwhelmingly accurate in how he handles these positions. Just more or less keeps from blundering, and everything is okay. Okay, maybe c4 is interesting here. So this might be a way of trying to get a little wiggle room here. I mean, if he plays bishop h7, king h8, and he doesn't have time to rescue his bishop. So that might be a way of playing. And if he plays bishop to f1 or bishop to e2, well, if bishop to e2, you'll trade. You could play bishop to g6 as well, but you can just trade. And then play queen c6, b5, a5, b4, and so on, and go for queenside play. All right, so bishop g6, takes, knight f3, bishop f6, queen d2, takes. And now black has done very well and has finally achieved a position where at least there's a plan, something you can do to bother white. And in fact, he did a very good job with that. So the one thing I'm not sure I like here, you played rook to c4, and this is okay, but it's not really clear to me what the rook is doing on c4 that it's not doing on c8. Now, it lets you double rooks. That's fine. But I'm not sure there's such a rush to do it. I mean, I think what I would try to play right away is go for the minority attack right away. So maybe queen to c6, and then play b5 and so on. Also, okay, say queen c6, knight e5. You could even consider playing bishop takes e5 because, all right, let's say he plays this. It's not really clear that this is such a fantastic piece. So as long as you can keep his kingside play from really getting dangerous, you can end up with a favorable kind of imbalance here, where your knight is going to take over some light squares. Anyway, so from here, b5, and so on. So you go for b4. You could also go for knight b6, c4. But you'd have to be careful that some kind of whiz-bang attack like this doesn't become too worrisome. Okay, so rook to c4 happened. Knight e5 takes, bishop takes, rook takes, rook f to c8, rook a to e1, and now, not a bad move, queen to d8. So this clears the path for the b pawn, and the queen is going to help defend over on the king side. But it's also possible to play queen to d6 instead. This isn't so bad either. Maybe keeping the queen more of a presence on the queen side, so that after b5 and b4 and takes, you can play queen to a3. Right, so let's say all this happens, kind of like in the game. a5, and you play b4, takes, and then you eventually play bc and bc. Okay, from there the queen can come to a3. So, just a possibility, but again, what you played is fine too. So this is just maybe very small fine points. Okay, queen f4, queen f6, queen g4, and b5. So this is really, really seriously impressive stuff for playing for just a year. a3, a5, rook 1 to e3, b4, takes, queen g3, takes. See, and now you played queen to d8, so you're now trying to, okay, maybe fix is too strong a word, but, if the queen was on d6, this could have already been done right away. Okay, rook f3, queen c7, rook e to e3, takes. And yeah, you're absolutely right in your assessment of this position. Certainly, black is better. I mean, you have no weaknesses in your position. White has two weaknesses, or 1.5 weaknesses in his, namely this pawn on c3 and the pawn on d4, in that if the pawn on c3 ever drops, the d4 pawn is likely to follow it to the grave very soon. Now, what should black do here? I think here black made a mistake and didn't really understand how to handle this position, or maybe at least didn't figure it out soon enough. So black brought the king to d6, so activating the king. But in fact, this is perhaps a bit of a mistake, and the reason why is that there's simply nothing for the king to do on d6 or going further over to the queen side. It's very easy for white to stop any serious king penetration. And in fact, the king needs to stick around to defend the kingside pawns. Or what I should say is that some piece needs to stick around to defend the kingside pawns. And you should always try to do this as economically as possible. So the king is probably at least as powerful as a bishop or a knight in an endgame, but it's not as powerful as a rook. So you should defend as cheaply as you can. So the king is a less valuable, not from the standpoint of checkmate, but from the standpoint of what it can do, functionally less valuable piece than the rook. So if we have to keep something defending the king side, it should be the king. Well, what should black do instead? Well, black should activate the rooks kind of the way he does in the game. So we should do that right away. So rook to a8 maybe, and either rook to a3 or maybe play rook to a1 check and bring it around to the back, or go to a2, and then similarly activate the second rook after that's done. So that way, you can attack the c3 pawn, but you can do it from many different angles, right? You could double on the c file. You could attack from both sides of the pawn on the c file. You could attack it from below on the c file, and you could attack it from the side. And again, potentially from both sides, but okay, not likely here. And of course, some combination. So you could attack it from in front and from the side, or from behind and from the side. So rook a8 would be best, but king f8 was played, king f1, king e7, king e2, king d6, rook e to f3, and okay, rook 8 to c7. So again, kind of a step in the wrong direction. By the way, an interesting possibility back with the king on f8 is to play the move g5. Let's see. So king f1, let's say g5 here. So the idea is, okay, if rook takes, then rook c3. And we've kind of broken through, and this d pawn is still a weakness. So after rook c3, all right, probably white should draw after king to e2. So maybe we're one tempo too late. Maybe we should play, let me see if we can do it here. Maybe g5 right here. Rook g5, rook c3, takes. And now on king f1, we have rook to d3, rook to g4. Okay, and then f5. And then we have g5. No, we're just, darn it, we're just one move too late, because g5, rook h5. So if our king was one move more active, we could do that. So here, white can play king to e2, or if rook to d2, king e1, king e2. So this would be nice if we could get it to work, but maybe we're just a touch too late. Let's see. Okay, if we go digging around back here, let's say g3, maybe king f7. Okay, certainly black is better, but I think white is still holding without too much trouble. Alright, so it's close, but because of this, maybe the g5 idea isn't best in this exact position. So we should activate the rooks instead. Okay, so after king to d2, black shows that he's a very fast learner and realizes, okay, there's nothing for the king to do, so rook to b7 and rook a4. So this is excellent, really impressive. King d3, rook a2, king e3, and now rook b to b2, which is not bad, but more accurate was rook to c2, king d3, and now rook b to b2, or rook to a2, king e3, king e7. Okay, we go back, and now rook to b3 and rook c2, and then rook b to b2. So we win a pawn by kind of alternating these threats against the c pawn and the f pawn. So rook b to b2 is, you know, it would have been better to keep this pawn and, you know, play king e7 or play rook c2. And, you know, I think we can just win a pawn by force. So rook b to b2 is a mistake. Rook f7, rook e2 check, king f4, rook f2, rook g2, rook g7. Actually, h4 might be a little bit better, because after this, again, black finds the best move, rook a to e2. So now white's got some trouble here. He played rook to g3, and here black missed the chance to increase the advantage. Or, well, I should say to keep a big advantage. So rook to e4 check was right. And after king f3, rook c2. And once again, we're exploiting that the kind of awkward defense here for that white has. So it's hard for him to keep his king safe and keep his rooks active and keep the queenside pawns protected. And ultimately, he can't keep it all together. So rook takes g3, and now it's a draw. So white is just in time. And here white plays the only move. So again, very good play by white. I mean, you know, got outplayed, but, you know, kept in there, kept fighting. And really, I mean, if this is a 1500 against a mid to high 1600, then, you know, I don't, you know, I sort of fear playing against 1800s if this is what C players play like these days. So rook c3, king g2. Simpler to play just king f2. You can just give up the pawn and bring your king over and draw very easily with a Philidor type draw. But anyway, king g2 is fine. h4, and either the game was agreed drawn here, or this was as far as the submission went anyway. So really well played game, very logical play, and as far as the general problem goes, again, you know, all you can do is try to create problems. And, you know, if your opponent plays really well, then, you know, the rating doesn't really matter. You know, it's you know, there's no law that says if your rating is 1500, you have to play like a 1500 does the whole game. I mean, you didn't play like a 1650. So, you know, I think it was very impressive all the way around. But again, as a general rule, when I'm black, what I try to do when I'm playing a low-rated player, but, you know, a good lower-rated player, you know, someone who's close enough to me that there's, you know, always it's going to be a good fight, I try to play an opening where there's going to be problems for them to solve. So where they can't just play solidly and make me have to work for, you know, the full 4, 5, 6 hours to drag out the point. So that would be my best recommendation. So, you know, don't do anything crazy, but at least make the position where, you know, just solid routine play won't be good enough. All right. So I hope everyone enjoyed seeing their games and maybe learned a thing or two. And I'll see you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.